All right, as my single-handed quest to restore Western literary tradition continues, we are dealing with part 4 of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Blithedale romance. So in the last episode, we got... oh, by the way, before I start, we do have a secret stream tonight for the patrons, so just be mindful of that and bring hot ideas. Okay, so in the last episode, we got a grip on how Zenobia and Priscilla are actually sisters, unbeknownst to Zenobia for the longest time, and to the reader as well. They're both daughters by the same man, this guy Old Moody. After Coverdale gets this figured out with the story in the bar when he meets Old Moody and gets him drunk, he continues living in the city for a while, trying to extricate himself from the influence of his three friends. It's an interesting scene. He's very introspective about it. He says at one point, "The more I consider myself as I then was, the more do I recognize how deeply my connection with those three had affected all my being." And this feels true, doesn't it? The way our selves get entangled with others and shaped by them and in some sense determined by their influence. It's maybe not so bad a thing, but it's worth being aware of. It tends to make me careful about involving myself in people's lives. And it's part of the reason I'm cautious about doing YouTube shows with random internet people. It's like, do I want to become mutually responsible with this person? Will they elevate me or drag me down, and so on? Anyway, Coverdale is thinking about all of this. And he says at one point, "The bands that were silken once are apt to become iron fetters when we desire to shake them off. Our souls, after all, are not our own. We convey a property in them to those with whom we associate, but to what extent can never be known until we feel the tug, the agony of our aborted effort to resume an exclusive sway over ourselves." That's really interesting. I will admit that this entanglement has happened to me more than once in life, and it often happens in a way that you're not totally cognizant that it's happening. These are the mysteries of psychology, and as I've said before, I find that the novelists are the best explainers of them, better than the psychologists in my experience. By the way, I'm going to go into some stuff about reform here, and I'm going to show you now some images of 19th century pamphleteering and so on, and book publishing about this topic of reform. Reform being the key word here, okay? It's really interesting to me. It's become really interesting. I mentioned in the last episode that I was deeply interested in this thing, reform, of the 1830s and 1840s. And I got to doing a little bit of a deep dive on it, and as you listen now for a bit, I'm going to show some of the stuff I dredged up on like archive.org and Google Books, just first pages, cover pages of books. This really was, it seems, a full moral revolution, and it seems to have begun in England, spread to Europe and America. It touched every aspect of American life and left almost no institution unreformed. To my mind, this is very much parallel to the wokeness revolution we're all enduring now, which is maybe a bit demoralizing because it's pretty clear that nobody in the 1840s was capable effectively of resisting the tidal wave of moral and political renovation. It wasn't just abolitionism, but women's rights, monetary reform, labor reforms, the temperance movement, reforms to the way people dress, Sabbath reform, it just goes on and on. And the North Star of the movement seems to have been simply, everything old is bad and needs replacing. And to me, this is kind of worse than demoralizing. It's even ominous because the reform pamphlets and initiatives seem to continue right up to the Civil War. Somehow they handled it peacefully in Victoria's England, but it does seem to have changed many of their institutions as well. Speaking of England, there's one really interesting line that I wanted to mention here, where this is just on another topic, I suppose, where Coverdale speaks of the time that he's been away from Blithedale in the city. And he says, quote, "As it was already the epoch of annihilated space, I might, in the time I was away from Blithedale, have snatched a glimpse at England and been back again. Isn't that an interesting notion? The epoch of annihilated space. He means, of course, steamships zooming back and forth across the Atlantic, and probably the telegraph too, by extension, I suppose. So I don't know. I mean, maybe technological change does mean that at some points in history, reform is necessary. I mean, certainly the cotton gin makes slavery less necessary, for example. And maybe it seems ludicrous to suggest that the internet and computers make something like gender unnecessary in the same way. But to be honest, I could see history going that direction, and if it does, it simply it simply leaves resistors in the dust. And it's possible that in 150 years there won't be anyone who opposes gender fluidity and LGBTQ month in the same way as nobody supports slavery nowadays. It just becomes a defunct position. After all, we've half accepted it already, right? The way that professionalization demands you take no notice of a person's gender, and the way avatars and anonymous accounts allow for gender to remain a mystery whenever one is online. Anyway, okay, so Coverdale wanders around the city after talking to Moody when he sees a flyer outside the Lyceum Hall. By the way, this is an interesting institution. Hawthorne says that these Lyceum halls had popped up everywhere, and lectures were the main entertainment, especially in winter. But also magicians and wax figure presentations and Mormon prophets and anything else that needed a stage. Coverdale sees that the Veiled Lady is performing tonight, so of course he goes inside. After surveying the scene, he recognizes a man one row in front of him. Clearly, it's Hollingsworth. Now, he hasn't seen him in a while, but he sneaks up and whispers in his ear, trying to sort of stick the dagger in, "Where have you left Zenobia?" But Hollingsworth keeps his cool. Then the show starts. It's just what you imagine from the movies. A charlatan of the first order doing his mesmerist rhetoric, talking about how the Veiled Lady is in another time-space continuum that, than we are in the audience, up there behind her veil. In fact, he has a bunch of roughnecks come up on stage and pick her chair up and try to clap in her ear and basically get any reaction out of her, but she sits deadly still. So the mood is set. The New Age movement was one of the symptoms of the Reform movement, it seems, that was sweeping the nation, or it came into fad at the same time, or maybe it was vice versa in terms of the influence there. Coverdale expresses disapproval of all this, by the way, suggesting that this sort of spiritualism is either fake or else a kind of demonism that we shouldn't meddle with. The charlatan running the show, Coverdale recognizes as, you won't be surprised, Professor Westervelt, the guy with the fancy, gold teeth and white shirt and so on. Coverdale says of the speech that Professor Westervelt gives, about the mesmerism, "It was eloquent, ingenious, plausible, with a delusive show of spirituality, yet really imbued throughout with a cold and dead materialism. I shivered as at a current of chill air issuing out of a sepulchral vault, and bringing the smell of corruption along with it. He spoke of a new era that was dawning upon the world, an era that would link soul to soul, and the present life to what we call futurity, with a closeness that should finally convert both worlds into one great, mutually conscious brotherhood." So, you get it? I mean, sounds relevant, doesn't it? But to his credit, Coverdale knows it's all empty rhetoric, but the crowd is into it. Halfway into the show, the Veiled Lady stands up and pulls the veil off, shocking Westervelt most of all, and certainly everyone else, because it's Priscilla, although you may have suspected it by now. Hollingsworth leaps up on stage and offers her his hand, saying, "Come, you are safe," and she runs off with him. High drama, great scene. Okay, the next thing that happens is Coverdale heads back to Blithedale, and when he gets there, it seems almost empty. Barn doors swinging, but then he hears voices in the woods. And here, the description gets really weird. The chapter is called "The Masqueraders," and that's really our only clue to what's going on. Hawthorne narrates it in this way that would otherwise be totally confusing. Coverdale says he starts seeing in the woods dancing around an Indian chief, the goddess Diana, a Bavarian broom girl, a Negro of the Jim Crow order, and various allegoric characters from the Fairy Queen. The point is, they're all in costume and having a carnival moment. Hawthorne loves this, by the way. He did this at the end of The Marble Faun, too, his last finished novel. It's also kind of a standard scene in romantic novels of the 19th century. You can read Russian literary theorist M.M. Bakhtin on this. He points out that carnival always signifies a reversal of social roles and other inversions of norms. Long and short of it is that as it winds down, Coverdale walks into a fight happening between Zenobia and Hollingsworth while Priscilla watches. Basically, Zenobia, age 24, is feeling jilted, I think, because Hollingsworth admits that he loves Priscilla now. She gives him the classic jilted woman speech about how his ego is huge and all he ever thinks about is himself and so on. Hollingsworth calmly replies that she's being hysterical. Zenobia then accuses Priscilla of being changed, and Priscilla blurts out that they are sisters. Big reveal for Coverdale, who is listening, hears this for the first time, though I think Zenobia had discovered it just a day or so earlier. Hollingsworth and Priscilla leave the scene, in a fury, sort of. Zenobia stays behind in the woods weeping, not even aware, I think, for a time that Coverdale is still there, basically just watching her weep and kind of waiting in case she needs anything. When she finally looks up, rubs her eyes, and recognizes him standing there, she says to him, "It is a genuine tragedy, is it not?" She says some spiteful things that you would expect, tell Hollingsworth he murdered me, and so on. But what's interesting is that this breaking off of a flirtation also turns her off from the whole project of social reform. I'm not sure exactly why these things are entangled, but it kind of makes sense to me intuitively that, an activist woman, once she's jilted and sort of, kicked to the curb, loses her sort of, her activist passion or whatever. Anyway, she says, "I am weary of this place and sick to death of playing at philanthropy and progress." Or she reminds me of one of those trad wives on Instagram where as long as they're getting the attention they seek, the act is working for them. But, if that becomes an uncool thing and the act goes sideways, you get the sense that their real interest was in the attention all along and not the social conservatism or whatever. She even says she intends to become a Catholic, Zenobia does, and move to a nunnery. But the next chapter begins at midnight. Okay, Coverdale, after the talk with Zenobia, as she sort of disappears, Coverdale has sat down on the ground, right there in the woods, and he wakes up under the past full moon with real bad vibes. He has a hunch, he says, and he goes to check the pond in the forest, but finds only a shawl. But this is enough to set him worrying, so he runs back to the farm, wakes Hollingsworth up. Remember, Hollingsworth had almost become his enemy at this point, but he still wakes him up, says he needs help. Hollingsworth comes. In the course of the knocking on the window and stuff, they woke up Farmer Silas in the process, and so he also comes along. The worry is that Zenobia drowned herself, like Ophelia in Hamlet. The scene is incredibly vivid because of the darkness, the forest, the high stakes, and so on. By the way, I couldn't help but think all through reading this novel and thinking about how to summarize it, that would make an awesome 10-episode series on Netflix. And there are so many novels from the 19th century that are sort of unexplored in that way that would be, it's just perfect. A 200-page novel can easily be divvied up into 10 or 12 episodes, I think, if it's done well. Anyway, they get a little paddle boat, go out on the pond with some long sticks, for poking around, and eventually, appropriately, Hollingsworth pokes what feels like a body. When they pull her up dead, he has actually stabbed her in the heart, of course. Zenobia killed herself. She drowned herself. So they carry her back to the farm. They give the body to the womenfolk. There's an interesting paragraph here about about tradition and funerals and the struggle to remake the world during the Reform Age in this utopian social experiment. Coverdale reports, quote, "She, Zenobia, was buried very much as other people have been, for hundreds of years gone by. In anticipation of a death, we Blithedale colonists had sometimes set our fancies at work to arrange a funereal ceremony which should be the proper symbolic expression of our spiritual faith and eternal hopes. And this we meant to substitute for those customary rites, which were molded originally out of the Gothic gloom, and by long use, like an old velvet pall, have so much more than their first death smell in them. But when the occasion came, we found it the simplest and truest thing, after all, to content ourselves with the old fashion, taking away what we could, but interpolating no novelties, and particularly avoiding all frippery of flowers and cheerful emblems." So basically, when the rubber hits the road, they didn't have the heart or guts to do some newfangled funeral ceremony. Instead, they just went with the old rites. Interesting. Some years later, okay, so that's sort of our last scene of the main drama of the novel, and then you get a chapter that goes, some years later. Coverdale runs into Hollingsworth. Oh, by the way, I should say, a lot of the critics that I've read on this suggest that, Hawthorne didn't really know what to do with this feminist Zenobia character, and that's part of the reason that he ends up sort of, making Hollingsworth choose the young, sprightly girl, and basically Zenobia kills herself. There's no other path for her. In that sense, maybe Hawthorne indicates kind of social conservatism, and I think so, probably. Anyway, a couple years later, Hollingsworth and Coverdale run into each other in the market. Coverdale sees that Priscilla, who's with Hollingsworth, kind of looks at him with this, urging him not to speak to Hollingsworth, as if not to, tear at the old wound. But he can't resist. He asks mockingly how the grand project for reforming prisoners is coming. Hollingsworth admits that he never even started it. Coverdale continues, twisting the knife. He says, "Up to this moment, how many criminals have you reformed?" Hollingsworth admits, "Not one. Ever since we parted, I have been busy with a single murderer." And at that admission of guilt, Coverdale sort of says of himself, "The tears gushed into my eyes and I forgave him." So it seems that the two guys kind of make up when Hollingsworth understands that he kind of screwed over Zenobia. Then the last chapter, which I kind of hate, is called Miles Coverdale's Confession. It's quite a dud, if I'm being honest. It's unnecessary, in my opinion. He reflects a little on his time at Blithedale. He expresses doubt about utopian projects and reform in general. He says, as regards human progress, let them believe in it who can and aid in it who choose. He says he could rally himself to offer his life up in some cause that would be worthy of a sane man dying for it, quote, if Kossuth, for example, would pitch the battlefield of Hungarian rights within an easy ride of my abode. He says then he would throw himself on the bayonets, but other than that, he's not interested in participating anymore. He goes into the last two paragraphs, which are very melodramatic and dumb, where he confesses in the last line that he loved Priscilla. So, that's supposed to be sort of a big shocking ending, I guess. The end. Alright, well, when I finished typing here what I've got, I realized that this experiment in offering 4 podcast episodes where I try to replace the project of reading it for yourself, it kind of doesn't work, I think. You know the plot now, but it's more about the way the plot is told, I think. And you're bound to miss some of that if you're just listening to my summaries and not reading the novel yourself. I really doubt whether the kind of catharsis that we want can be achieved in this kind of summary. So we're done with the book. I hope you enjoyed what you could enjoy here in this second-hand thing. Mainly, I hope it gives you a better understanding of some of the history of early-ish America in its cultural center around Boston, middle of the 19th century, utopian socialists, reform movements, new technologies, but at the same time, these stubborn, eternal truths of the human heart that seem to limit what sorts of changes societies of people are able to effectively undertake. There will always be love triangles, obsessive alpha men who use and dispose of women, and jilted hysterical women whose emotions make them tear everything apart. This is an important insight. Maybe Hawthorne wasn't the first to investigate it, but I think his insight here is part of the reason that in America, transcendentalism and nature worship and individualism tended to be the move, whereas in Europe, socialism and Marxism caught on. I don't think it's incorrect to say that skepticism was more prevalent in America than it was in Europe for a time, that Protestantism in their blood may have kept them safe from the inane utopian projects that beset places like Russia and France. Keep in mind, Melville dedicated Moby Dick to Hawthorne. And so this sensibility, this skeptical, ambiguous sensibility may have been best expressed by them, but I find traces of it in a lot of writers of that period. The Americans would reform themselves more readily than they would try to reform their institutions, at least until the Gilded Age and the progressive movement took over in the early 20th century. Just look at this tiny quatrain from Emily Dickinson to see what I mean. Soto! Explore thyself. Therein thyself shalt find the undiscovered continent. No settler had the mind. And to be honest, the longer I continue to look at these things and listen to the pundits and talkers, the more I incline away from systematic reforms. In fact, anyone who talks of a system, I don't know. I actually have this double inclination, maybe like Coverdale himself. I'm attracted to political talk, and especially to systematic and revolutionary politics. But the reality is, I never sign up. And I always find that if you wait long enough, the moment passes, and the movement starts to look kind of dumb in retrospect. I know some of you will hear me sucking the air out of the room with this kind of talk, and maybe even say I'm a psyop or a fed or whatever, because I'm not talking about moving to Montana with a stockpile and restarting civilization or whatever. But I'm not standing in anyone's way either. Go ahead. If you can pull it off, it would be cool, I think. A lot of Americans take pride in their genealogy. If their ancestors were among the first pilgrims to arrive in the 1620s or 1630s or on the Mayflower even. To me, these people were, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, were pretty much fanatics. They probably had a screw loose. I'm more proud that my family seems to have arrived at some point in the 1700s after some basic infrastructure was up and running, And yeah, America is dying, same way that England was dying in 1620, and maybe even for similar reasons, basically like a turn to multiculturalism, which is what Protestantism was in a way. In a way. Oh, I say that because I was reading Locke's essay on toleration yesterday. I don't think I'll do an episode on it because it's kind of boring, but the thing is, you realize reading that Protestantism unleashed this sectarian jockeying for power, which first of all necessitated toleration, but more than that, turned England into a divided country where trust was greatly diminished. What's amazing is when you realize that religion itself, theology, right down to its bones, is unavoidably a political question. And yes, on one end of the spectrum, on the Scylla side, Scylla and Charybdis, there exists that problem that arises when people are allowed to question everything, say anything, challenge authority, undermine institutions. Yeah, everything turns to faction and things fall apart then. But I think that, for me, personally, in spite of all of that, and even understanding the danger it involves, I remain in my blood a Protestant. And I think Jesus was a Protestant, and I think only Protestants go to heaven. But it seems to me that every other path leads toward ossifying institutions, held by always increasingly corrupt and corruptible power. So in theory, it makes sense. We need a pope and an orthodoxy and a catechism and, a prince to keep things from unraveling. And in theory, I would sign up for that. But I've read so much of this American literature and learned so thoroughly to endure epistemological uncertainty and metaphysical ambiguity that I refuse to sign the contract. Like, yeah, sometimes I go along and raise my fist and enjoy supporting a cause, but I never finally assent because I'm an anti-totalitarian, really. Like, I'm Antifa, Like, actually, though. It almost feels like something that runs deeper than my reason here I'm talking about. Like, that's what I mean when I say it's in my blood to resist, to refuse to sign up, to stay on the outside, to not join, to not be a member, a citizen, a subject. You understand? When I was 23, I read Dostoevsky's best novel, Demons. It was based on the life of Sergei Nechayev, this radical anarchist and author of Catechism of a Revolutionary, which you should definitely read about on Wikipedia. I think I even had an AOL Messenger handle going by that name. Because at the time, I felt like, okay, all my peers are turning to socialism and other radical politics, criticizing George Bush, but now even criticizing what they called the American empire and ragging on about Orientalism and empire and all that. But I knew intuitively that nothing would ever really change unless somebody rallied together at least 20 of his closest friends and started a true anarcho-chaos movement like Nechayev did, to take down the establishment. It was like a dare for me to be interested in this Nechayev guy. It's like, if you want change, be serious. Let's, firebomb something. Of course, I disavow, and I disavowed even then. But I still think Nechayev was right that this is the path, if you want liberation from the status quo. Everything else is just talk. I mean, you're not going to be allowed to start a little Waco with like a little cult. I mean, if it gets to a certain point, they accuse you of, abusing the women or the children or whatever, and the feds come in and break it up, right? This happens over and over again. But all my friends didn't want to be Sergei Nechayev, and they didn't want to do, anarchism truly, right? They talked about it, but they didn't want to do it. They all just wanted to vote for John Kerry. So, I don't know. I do give people credit who make a move and try to do a Brook Farm to build a new community. That's impressive action, okay? Maybe the reason I don't go sign up is that the timing feels wrong for me right now. I feel like, I've got kids. I'm middle-aged. It always seems people who are doing this are in their 20s and 30s, as the people at Brook Farm were, or at least at Blithedale. But those of you who are doing it, Godspeed. I hope you win, Anyway, great job listening to all this. The next episode will return to the real classics, to the ancients. I'm going to do an episode on Plutarch's Lycurgus. I just got my copy of Plutarch. I'm halfway into the Solon essay. I'm probably just going to do like one episode for each of the lives that he covers there. Maybe I won't do them all, but the ones that I think are worthy. Actually, first, I'm going to drop in here a reading of a postmodern metaphysical short story by John Barth, just as a gift to listeners. I think some of you will really like it and enjoy it. But then Plutarch, then some Montaigne even on Plutarch, and then one episode on Emile Choron, and I think that's all I've got lined up for right now. We do have a secret stream meeting tonight at 9 p.m., so all patrons will get a notification email, I hope. But if you miss the email, wake up, 9 o'clock tonight. Just put it in your calendar. Let's talk about utopia and reform and, direct action and American history and capitalism and human psychology, womanish petulance, and whatever. Anything else I can get from you guys as a suggestion would be good. Thanks for listening. We're done with the Blithedale romance. Good job. See you next time.